Hello there fellas, today I'm gonna show you how I quickly painted this miniature in Grimdark style. The miniature is made by Luna 3D and comes already pre-supported. You can get it for free on their Cults 3D page, as well as other stuff. I'm going for the no man's land feel. That means uneven land, mud, old trees. For this one I use 40mm base, pieces of cork to build the general shape of the landscape. You can always remove the excess by hand, use some super glue and baking soda to fill the cracks, and to create additional texture. At least that's what my proctologist said to me. I used some dry roots to imitate the dead tree, cut off the excess, dry fit the composition, create fitting indent with a Dremel, and fix it with super glue and baking soda once again. Clean up the working place, polystyrene, cut off 2 or 2.5mm of this. Since it's gonna represent the old wood, we don't want it to be perfect. Sand it with a nail file to remove the traces of cutting. Use something to fix these two pieces in place. I used a blue tack, carefully using hobby knife, add wood grain and additional wear and tear on both sides of the planks. Now glue those pieces together, super glue and baking soda. I used an old toothbrush to remove the excess of baking soda. I made barbed wire using 0.3mm copper wire. Link to the tutorial is in the description. Using rounded pliers I bent them into desired shape and fit onto the cross. Then I wrapped around the remaining part. Just be careful and don't impale yourself. Cut off the excess and fix it into place using thin super glue. Next I wanted to make something resembling a war banner waving in a wind, and for this I used an aluminum can. Just cut desired strip with scissors. Preliminary fit, carefully bent into desired shape. Apply some super glue. Don't forget to remove the excess with your bare finger. Here is the only grass that I touch in my life. Just pick it up and stick it in some logical place. For example at the base of the tree or a deep crevice. Now it's time for heavy texturing. For this I used AK wet ground. Reminds me of my toilet. Just scoop it up and start covering the base. I did it in a semi-controllable way, mainly just to cover the cork surface and introduce some randomness into the texture. Also I placed an additional skull at the bottom. To fix our boy into the place, drill some holes in his feet, stick some wires with the super glue in there and snap the excess. Before gluing him into place I wanted to add some additional texture to the base, so I scattered small rocks and pieces of cork all over and fixed them with a mixture of water and PVA and glue. In retrospective I should have added much more water, so this wouldn't happen. Twitter artists. Feel free to use it as a reference. After PVA glue dried, I put our calcium boy into his dissolving place. And here's the scenery in the miniature ready. Now it's time for painting. Since we're working with Grimdark, I used black primer. Just put some thinner, some flow improver, and of course the primer. Stir it with the old synthetic brush and backflow it. Also reminds me of my toilet. Do some test spraying and go to town on this sucker, applying primer in a short controlled bursts. In total I applied 2 thin layers all over the miniature. Fucking delicious. Now pull out your wet palette. If you don't have one, you definitely should. You don't need to buy one, just make it yourself. At this stage I covered everything in Rhinox hide. Now I wanna use some other dark colors to introduce the variety. Just applying it in random patches all over the base. In retrospective this step is redundant, since I made the ground too bright and had to restart. Now a mixture of Rhinox hide and more Fang brown. Using it I cover all wood elements of the base in a nice thick coat. Then I use a Grux shade wash to darken the ground even more. Using the brown mixture I covered the banner. With a pure Morgfag brown I highlight the wood, as well as some patches on the ground. I'm creating a base color for the bones in the banner using 1 drop of Rhinox hide and approximately 3 drops of Zandri dust. Once again this step is redundant, since I could have used my airbrush to apply the base coat. But since I'm stupid I have to learn from my mistakes. I'm applying it to the skeleton in thin layers and trying to avoid the trumpet as best as I can. Since this is the base color for the skeleton I'm painting everything around him. The only exception is the eye holes, which I leave dark. Also don't forget about the small skull at the bottom. Now I'm doing the first round of highlighting using pure Zandri dust. dust. I'm applying generous highlights to the brightest areas, leaving shadows covered only in the base coat color. This step requires more control than the previous one, however you still can afford to be somewhat sloppy. For additional shading I use Grimdark Trumpet Shade, applying it generously but in a controlled way all over the miniature. Mostly I leave it in the deepest recesses, however I remove it with my brush from the brightest areas. And also some shading for the little guy. While the shading on the skeleton is drying, I'm using base coat bone color to highlight the wood parts, applying it to the sharpest edges and areas that would naturally wear with the time. Additionally, I mixed brownish variation of this color for the same purpose. I'm applying it in semi-random pattern to make it look natural, making final highlights with the pure Zandri dust. Now the wash that we applied over the skeleton has dried, and we can come back with the final highlights. First, once again Zandri dust. Highlight the same areas that we did previously, but cover less of the area. And for the final skeleton highlight I'm making a mixture of Citadel Zandri dust and Vallejo Off-White. The majority of these highlights gonna go to the arms and the skull, as well as some minor highlights to the knees and the feet, also a few highlights on the ribs. The bony boy is boned. Now it's time to paint the trumpet. I wanted to make it look like an old brass, so I'm gonna start from the brass scorpion as a base layer. With this I'm covering all of the trumpet, while being careful in order not to paint the skeleton, since removing metallic paints from the bones gonna be pain in the ass. For the first layer of verdigris effect, I'm using Army Painter's Talisman Teal. I'm applying it carefully in dabbing motion to the deepest recesses where verdigris would naturally accumulate. To represent some clean brass steel coming through, I'm using Retributor Gold. Carefully dab it on the areas that would naturally experience more friction, leaving them clear and free of the verdigris. Also apply it to the areas that will catch most of the light, creating a nice contrast between upper, more lighter part of the tube and darker bottom part, still covered in a dark brown, representing the natural shadow. To add some additional edging, I'm covering everything with a Crux Earth Shade. Finally, I'm using verdigris effect from Army Painter as a lighter verdigris, applying it roughly to the same areas. At this point the earth is too light for my taste, so I'm applying a heavy wash of a dark brown. Then wash it over with a Crux Earth Shade. Using lighter tones, apply very gentle highlights to the wood. Using lighter browns, apply very gentle and minimal highlights to the mud. I'm using lead belcher to base coat the barbed wire. Be extremely careful so not to paint the wood parts. For the rust effect I first used dark rust from Army Painter, lightly covering the areas on the barbed wire that I want to see rusted. Then I'm using fresh rust. Repeat the process, covering approximately the same places. Finally I'm using dry rust paint. I'm placing only a few dots of this to represent only the freshest rust. Since wood is placed into the moist environment, it would naturally accumulate some moss. For the moss I'm using the same recipe I was using in my Hornet diorama. Start with the darkest green you have, maybe even mixed in with black, and cover the majority of the area that you want to be covered with moss, maybe even more. Using lighter and lighter greens cover less and less of the area, representing fresher moss. I'm repeating this process for the cross and for the old tree. For the banner I wanted a very simplistic pattern, and for the colors to complement the palette of the miniature. So I decided to go with the dark red to create a nice contrast with the green moss. The pattern ended up being a combination of lines with different width, some dots and some different crosses. After painting one side of the banner, I flipped it and repeated the pattern on the opposite side. I used lighter red to paint the places that would catch most of the light, to bring colors together and to show the edge of the banner. I covered everything in a Crux Earth Shade, pulling the shade down, since moisture and dirt would naturally accumulate at the bottom of the banner. To show that this is active battlefield, I wanted to leave some blood splatters. For this I used blood for the blood god mixed with the typhus corrosion and dabbed it semi-randomly onto the ground. For the dry bly effect, I used dry bly effect from Army Painter, placing a few dabs onto the cross and to the wider part of the banner. Finally, with the black paint, I rimmed the miniature. In my opinion, this is the most important part of the process. If you wanna know more about proper technique for this step, I can advise you to Google rimming for beginners. Finally, to represent accumulated water and moisture, I use still water from AK Interactive. Using toothpick, clay. I mix it with the rhinox hide and carefully place it around the mud and to the lower part of the miniature, where water would naturally flow. And this is it. Strictly speaking, it's not exactly grimdark. I do not particularly enjoy overlines on washes. However, it's so far from my usual style that I actually quite enjoy it. Realistically, this project was just a test of this style, which I'm planning to apply to my upcoming project. I'm quite happy with the composition and color palette, but I definitely still have to work with the mud. I hope you enjoyed the video, and with that, fuck off!